I'm Brien Henry, and in the back of the room we got Dr. Trey Koger with us today. I'm going to talk real briefly about corn and planting dates, some work we've done at Mississippi State. I arrived at Mississippi State in 2012, and I'm a research corn agronomist. So my goal is anything I can do to improve corn production practices for the Mississippi Mid-South corn growers. That's my goal. This is my first time at this meeting. It's an absolute honor to be asked to attend this, and I've really enjoyed myself and seen some great presentations so far. So I thank y'all for having me here as a guest. Also, I'd like to thank my students. They were listed as authors on the presentation, but Chatu and Matthew, they were the ones that conducted a great deal of this with the funding of the Mississippi Corn Promotion Board. So Mississippi State and MAFIS were responsible for a lot of the funds that were used to conduct this research, and then our friends within industry, be it Monsanto, Pioneer, Syngenta, and others, they've been very generous providing seed and advice. A little bit about my reasoning and how I got into this type of research. I had an exposure as a corn breeder. One of the things that I noticed limited corn productivity in my prior appointment was drought, and especially heat. In the middle of the summer, if you're trying to produce seed for further evaluation, it's next to impossible when the corn looks like that. It just won't go. And also, right out of graduate school, I landed in Colorado for 4 years. It rains about 16 inches a year where we lived. And if you ever thought there's a place you could go that will tighten you up as a farmer and make you appreciate water and when it falls and how the plant uses it, you could go out there and farm. It's tough. Anything other than wheat fallow is really challenging on the agronomic side. We are blessed to receive a lot of moisture in the Mississippi region, around 55 inches a year in this general area. So we get a lot of water, and what we do with it is of great importance to me, trying to present that. So speaking about water, temperature and moisture, heat and drought, two things that limit corn productivity. We can see that temperature in the red, it goes up in the summer, we know that, and rainfall, at least over the last 10 years, bottoms out in the summer months. It's hot and it's dry, and we'll get rainfall, we'll get thunder showers, we'll get 1.5 inches, but the type of water availability and the heat to go with it severely limits corn productivity. Those are the two things we don't want as corn producers. So especially during this time period of tasseling and silking, that's when we need moisture the most. Places they've done numerous studies to determine moisture shortages and what affects yield. It's that time period right there. That's the most critical impact on corn yield. So what we want is at that stage, we want it to look like this. We want water at that time, and really it always gets back to water. So this was Verona last year. We had some really nice rainfalls right at the right time. So my research, what are we going to do about it? Well, we can irrigate, but this is the Sustainability Systems Conference. We need to be smarter about how we use our water when we irrigate. So my research goal was this. This is typical recommendations of planting around March 15th through April 20th. And again, my region is the central Mississippi Mid-South region. I realize there are others in the audience that may be from Tennessee and maybe South Mississippi, you plant a little sooner. But by and large, this is what I hope to do with my research. So everyone watch closely, please. I want to do this, and that's the corn growth cycle there represented with the plant. I want to do this. Everybody get that? Just shift the entire production window forward. By doing this, you note that tasseling and silking, that critical stage where we need water and cool temperatures, that now is more likely to occur in May. If we get decent emergence, if we get some heat units early in the year. That really hasn't been the case the past 2 years. It has been challenging. But that's the goal of my research. So a lot of people have pushed out here into the middle of the summer and we can irrigate, or we can space the plants out so that air gets in the canopy, or do this, do that, pick the right hybrid. My research is on the front end. Which hybrids do better in the cool? How much of an influence is there with frost damage? Those types of things. So like I was saying, we're evaluating these planting date trials over multiple locations in years. It's hard to quantify that on the research side. There's so many variables. different soil types. If we plant earlier and moisture is no longer so limiting, can we raise the populations? Can we boost that up to improve yields? I think we can. If we shift that production window forward, can we also shorten the production window with shorter season hybrids, earlier maturing hybrids? And not drastically so, but one of the other speakers at this meeting has a goatee and he's from Georgia. The name is escaping me. Dowdy. He broke the record 2 years ago with DKEC 6208, 112-day hybrid. The other guy, Hula in Virginia, 532 bushels. He also did it with 112-day. So perhaps yield is not as tightly linked to maturity as we may once have thought. It might be about optimizing that window of available light, cooler temperatures, available precipitation, and getting that window just right and minimizing stresses on that plant. So we've done all these trials with the cold tolerance, frost damage, and we tried to use some of the best hybrids available to us, some that are being used in the field by farmers now. This is an example of a trial. This is DKC 6757. It's a good irrigated or dryland crop. We planted that March 14th at Mississippi State, which for us was really early. This is 2014. Took about 14 days to come up, and I've seen all the other presentations. It's got to come up immediately, and it's a weed if blah, blah, blah. I think there's something to that. But I also think there's something to planting early and getting your crop up and going on the front end, even if you have to suffer a little bit to those penalties associated with uneven emergence. I think sometimes that's a risk worth taking. Also a risk of a little bit of frost. We had a 20-something degree temperature one of the evenings on April 15th. Those plants were at V1, V2, had 5 or 6 nice leaves on it, and they were smoked. And my pals that aren't convinced this is going to work, they were kind of teasing me and saying, "Oh, Henry, did you see your corn? It got smoked." And then a few days later, we harvested in that particular plot. Again, it was 40,000, and it was a great year for corn. We only fertilized at 200 pounds of N, but we got a yield we were pleased with. The 4-rep average was actually above 250. So that's dry land. That field was a really nice soil type, a silty loam. Hadn't had corn on it in a while. But my point of this slide is that it can tolerate some frost damage. I don't think that's an end-all, be-all reason not to plant early. There are certain hybrids that do not respond well to a cooler, root-limiting environment. Some say that might be a phosphorus situation. Others may say that's just kind of the genetics and it'll grow out of it. I'm not really sure what the answer is, but some don't grow as well as others. And that's a method that we're investigating. A lot of these things, I wanted to throw a Bible verse in there about plowing and preparing ahead of time and getting the fields ready to go. And with that, if we're going to plant early, how are we going to do it? How do you implement this? What are we going to actually go do? So soil prep, a lot of that will take place in the fall, the year prior. So you get those beds made up, prepare that, roll them down with a roller, have a nice bed to plant into. If some of the folks in this room are of the no-till, the conservation systems, we're working on that too. This is a harder sell to plant early in a no-till scenario. It takes longer for your soil to warm up. So don't turn off entirely if you're no-till and you're in this room. I think there's still some benefit to be gotten for our no-till customers. Perhaps a strip till, perhaps the right cover crop that would support a tractor to go through the field. We're looking at other options in addition to a tillage bed situation. This doesn't work on every soil. We want to pick the right soils, lighter soils, soils with sand in them. That tends to do better. Picking the right hybrid. I'll get to that in a minute. Of course, you want to control the weeds. How do you deliver the fertilizer and all these other things? And if all this works well enough and we have, goodness gracious, a normal growing situation, you can harvest this crop a little bit on the front end and get to market ahead of everyone else. That's a real benefit when you can begin harvesting sooner and spread out your labor across a wider window. So what do we know? Definitely we want to rotate crops. Somehow that begins to get lost when I hear corn on corn on corn. And that's something with those high yields I showed you before. That was a USDA field that had been in cotton for eternity. Cotton, 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 cotton. And finally they said, "Oh yeah, Henry, you can use that 6-acre field." And And the corn crop did fantastic. There wasn't a drop of disease in that field, and it yielded well. We were pleased. Row spacing. You want to go on a 30 as opposed to a 38. All my data is based on 38 inches because that's the farm that we've got at Mississippi State. But you get a slight advantage on 30-inch rows. They've documented that. Keep the weeds down. Know what you're planting into, as mentioned by other researchers. And then rotate, 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 rotate. So this is what our planting date trial looked like. We selected different varieties and we planted them as early as possible. 4 hybrids were planted as early as possible, and then every 2 weeks after that first planting date, we came back and planted again. So the treatments are randomized through that field, but this is the summary. We had 25,000 plants per acre, 4 good hybrids from DeKalb and Pioneer, as early as possible, and then every 2 weeks after that. 200 pounds of N, that was our yield goal for around 200 bushel corn. And then we planted 2 to 2.5 inches, and we were planting early. I know it's tempting to go a little more shallow. We actually went deeper to keep the crows from getting at it. Because when you're the first person out there with corn, birds will go for it, the geese will. And if you get a little over 2 inches down in that 2.5, 2 3/4, the birds don't get you. But again, you got to have the right soil. I wouldn't recommend doing that in a heavy clay. And we controlled weeds. So in our trials, we measured a bunch of scientific things. There's pictures of me doing scientific light through the canopy to signify closure and use of available sunshine, and then greenness of the leaves. And I've got a series of graphs here that demonstrate yield, which is on our y-axis, and planting date on the x. So the earliest is signified by number 1, and then we go through the season approximately at 2-week intervals. In the different locations, we have Starkville, Verona, and then 2013 and 2014. But the point I want to make is if there's just an overall trend here that is as you go, in Starkville, that one really followed a trend. I'll get back to that. Verona, this one was all over the place, but it rained a historic amount in June and July. It was really a strange year. But what's the point of those yield slides is that as we delay planting, yield is going down. That's the take-home message. So the earlier, the better. And I would say, people can argue, oh, it's got to be 50 degrees and it's got to be 56 degrees, I heard this morning. There's a lot to that. But I understand that there's a perfect day to plant, and then there are all those other days that you're going to be planting as a farmer. So you've got to spread that window, and the point I'm making is if there is a perfect day to plant, I would cheat forward. That's my take on it, and other people may disagree. They're here at this meeting, they can go ahead and disagree with me. But I've got a couple of years of replicated data that's suggesting early planting is probably worth considering. This is just a different way of looking at the data by hybrids, different formats. So if we plant early and it looks like we're going to have a reasonable strategy, what if we increase the plant population? Then we looked at density. Our other trial was at 25,000, which is a little bit on the light side. But that's about what dryland growers are growing where we are. I think we can go a little higher. This is what 20,000 plants look like in the row. It's what 40,000 plants look like. So we had treatments between 20 and 40 at 5,000 increments. Now when we grow this and we have them in the field, the more plants there are, the less resources there are per plant. So at our 40,000 population, the ears begin to shrink a little bit. And it depends on which of these hybrids, how well they handle stress and how they partition resources into the grain. But we measured all of these compulsively and counted the kernels around and kernels long and how big are the individual 100-weight kernels. And we measured all those things by collecting ears at various times throughout the season. Point of this is when we get to the yield, which is kind of the catch-all, we're noticing that in 2013 we saw a nice bump around 35,000, and it was a wet year, so consider the year that these were grown. This is what 2014 looked like. Well, again, we've got population across the bottom by yield, had different planting dates, but we're still seeing an effect up around the 30 to 35,000. That's our target window of where we saw what appears to be a nice economic response. Same with Starkville. We've got a very similar trend where it even comes all the way up. I can't tell you that 40,000 works it appears to go up a little bit. We didn't see a tremendous fall off from not enough water or not enough resources, but I'm not sure. I don't think 40,000 pays. I think the sweet spot is somewhere between 30 and 35, which is more than what people are typically growing around where we are. Here's the 2015 that we just got compiled. I haven't got it in graph format. The point I wanted to make on this one that I've highlighted in red is that at 20,000, you're leaving money on the table. And that was excessively late planting date of May. Probably shouldn't have even planted corn, but I'm in the corn research business. We had to do it. Actually, we got some pretty reasonable yields. I'd suggest the Agrisure at Starkville, where it rained a good bit, planted in May, we got over 200 bushels. I'd never believed that would have been possible, but it was a good year for that. At Brooksville, the opposite of that was true. It was a very dry location, again planted the next day on May 9th. But here is the risk on the tail end. If you go too high and you catch a hybrid that's not well adapted to a clay soil type or whatever the case may be, that one struggled there. And this is the downside of going too high in the population. Pioneer just came out. I'd share this. Jeff Hollowell sent it to me. The populations that they're recommending agree quite well with what we had found because I went through there and looked at it. Additional trials, we're looking at seed treatments because, again, if we plant early, we need to have those seeds be protected and get them up and out of the ground like many different speakers are talking about. We're also getting into early hybrids so that we move the window and then shorten the production window of that corn. Had some successes with that. It goes back to risk versus reward. There's a risk. You can plant out here and get an absolutely perfect stand and everyone will come up and it can be 60-degree soil temperature and they emerge uniformly. But by pushing that window forward, you're avoiding some of the accumulated possibility of stress. So you're avoiding the heat and the drought that comes out here in summer. So this is the accumulated probability of having essentially either 2 weeks or 3 weeks of no rain. And that's bad for business as a corn farmer. So the earlier you go with planting, 60 days later when that crop is tasseling, you want to have as low of a probability of drought as possible. And what's not on here is a temperature graph. There could have been another graph showing that the further you get into the season, the hotter it gets. That's another big negative on corn production that we hope to avoid by planting a little bit earlier. We're doing precision ag work that Dr. Koger is going to talk about, some precision ag applications at their farm in corn production. Take a bunch of images. This kind of fits with what I was talking about. These are different hybrids planted on exactly the same day, exactly the same fertility, exactly the same population, everything. I could show you a million graphs, but if I'm picking, I picked this one. That one yielded a little better. But those were planted March 14th, and it was cold, and those are the ones that received that light frost, and those took off, and those languished. So differences exist. We've tried to measure those differences in growth chambers. We've looked at a million different variables, and in a controlled environment, we actually extracted the roots from a sandy media, and we ran them on a scanner and analyzed those roots. I could take an entire hour talking about root analysis. It would bore me and you, but we did it. It's tedious work, and we measured everything there was to measure, and that's something we see there are differences among hybrids. And finally, I'd just say early hybrids, we've got some really nice yield potential with these short season hybrids planted at a high population. The plants are much shorter. You can cram more into a tight area. And I think by raising populations up, planting early, I think we can get some really nice yields and avoid the risky, hot, dry parts of the summer. So here are the things I would do. I'd pick a good hybrid. Consider boosting your populations if you can get in early. Consider the fall bed prep. Plant deep enough so that the birds don't get it in a uniform depth. Make sure your planters sit right with the press wheels and whatnot. Apply your fertilizer in a split. Dr. Ebelhair will talk about the pros and cons of fertilizer application. I look forward to that. Consider doing this on a lighter soil and soil temperature. The current recommendation is 50 degrees and warmer. What if it's 48? What if The one we planted that was 250 bushels, we planted that on March 14th, and it was 46 degrees, well, colder than what it should be. And that seed sat in the ground for 14 days. Now, by and large, it came up fairly uniformly. I've heard a lot of talk about that, but by getting in earlier and taking advantage of the moisture and the cooler temperatures, I think it's worth it. Don't do this on a heavy clay soil. Don't plant too shallow. Consider not knocking down the beds with a do-all. We had a problem with that one year, and drainage was the big issue. And don't plant right before a big rain. You don't want a big flush of snow or cold water. It's one of the worst things you can get on an early corn crop. And if I had to pick some kind of a silver bullet to improve corn production right now that nobody's talking about, I'd say it is drainage, and I think getting oxygen to the roots in some manner, whether it's beds or breeding for a hybrid that gets a bigger root system so that it can breathe. I think that's what we need to look at a little bit more. Fluffing the soil, soil health, whatever that may be. Having the soil be able to breathe is of critical importance, and I'm not really even sure how to address that, but that's something that I'm going to be thinking about in the future. All these yield winners, Colors, Georgia, Hula, those folks all have a sandy, light soil, and their roots can breathe. And they're taking advantage of respiration, and that plant never goes under stress, and they baby it. I think that's fascinating. There's a lot of information to be gained from those types of trials.